In the merciless grip of Nebraska's worst winter storm in 50 years, a mother's desperate fight for survival is about to change a community forever. 3 horses, a mare and 2 young foals, abandoned in temperatures that have already claimed 7 lives this season. They huddle together against bitter winds that cut like steel, their bodies growing weaker with each passing hour. This isn't just another animal rescue story. This is about how a single decision in the darkest hours of a frozen night would spark a war between compassion and law, turning a quiet farming community upside down. They say the coldest storms reveal the warmest hearts, but for John Miller, opening his barn doors that night would cost him everything he had, and give him everything that matters. What follows is the story of how one farmer's choice to defy the law would expose a dark secret in their peaceful valley, leading to a battle that would test the limits of human kindness and prove that sometimes the greatest acts of humanity come with the highest price. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The old farmhouse creaked under the weight of gathering snow as John Miller pulled on his weathered boots at 4:30 a.m. His movements were automatic, practiced through 30 years of pre-dawn routines. Outside, the temperature display blinked, an angry -22, but the wind chill would make it feel closer to -40. John's calloused hands wrapped around his coffee mug, the only warmth he'd feel for the next few hours. At 58, every morning brought new aches, but the animals needed feeding whether his joints agreed or not. The bank's latest notice lay unopened on his kitchen table, another reminder that this winter could be his last on the family farm. The barn's ancient door protested as he pushed through deepening snow. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and cattle brought comfort. 8 dairy cows, 3 pigs, and a handful of chickens, all that remained of what was once one of Nebraska's most prosperous small farms. The empty horse stalls at the far end caught his eye, as they did every morning. 5 years had passed since he'd sold the last of his horses, a decision that still haunted him. "Morning, ladies," he called to the cows, his breath visible in the dim light. Martha, his oldest Holstein, mooed a response. She'd been with him through the worst of times, the drought of 19, Emma's passing, and the year they nearly lost everything. To medical bills, the animals were more than livestock. They were the only family he had left. The radio crackled with the morning farm report as he worked. More foreclosures in the county, 3 family farms sold to corporate interests last month. Alone, the Weather Service warned of an approaching storm system that would make today's cold seem mild. John glanced at the empty feed bins, calculating whether he had enough to see his animals through another week. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah Chen, the local veterinarian. Another farmer 2 counties over had to put down their entire herd after feed costs became too much. Sarah's message was clear. If he needed help, ask before it was too late. Pride had already cost too many their livelihoods. As John finished the morning chores, his eyes kept drifting to those empty horse stalls. Emma had loved their horses, especially the foals in spring. "Horses are God's way of teaching us about freedom," she used to say. The memory brought a familiar ache to his chest. He'd promised her he'd keep the farm going, keep their dream alive, but each year made that promise harder to keep. The sun finally breached the horizon, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of pink and gold. John paused at the barn door, surveying his land. The Miller farm had stood for 4 generations, weathering dust bowls, depressions, and droughts. His father had told him that the land would provide as long as you listened to it, respected it. These days, it seemed the only thing the land whispered was goodbye. Back in the house, John reviewed his accounts. The numbers hadn't improved overnight. They never did. 3 missed mortgage payments, equipment repairs he couldn't afford to make, and now this storm coming. Some nights he wondered if holding on was just delaying the inevitable. The corporate buyers would probably come calling again in spring, offering what they called a generous exit strategy. The local news played quietly on his ancient TV as he made breakfast. Another story about family farms going under, interspersed with warnings about the approaching storm. The meteorologist's voice carried an edge of genuine concern. This wasn't going to be an ordinary winter storm. This was shaping up to be the kind that rewrote record books and claimed lives. John's gaze fell on Emma's photo by the window, her smile as warm as ever. "What would you do, Em?" he whispered. The empty horse stalls nagged at his conscience. She would have kept them, whatever the cost. But Emma had always led with her heart. It was what he'd loved most about her, and what had sometimes made the harsh realities of farming harder to bear. The morning light revealed new snow already beginning to fall. According to the forecast, this was just the beginning. The real storm would hit tonight, bringing wind chills that could kill exposed livestock. In minutes, John pulled on his heavy coat, preparing for another trip to the barn. He had preparations to make if they were going to survive what was coming. As he stepped outside, the wind carried a sound that stopped him in his tracks. Distant, almost lost, in the growing storm, but unmistakable to anyone who'd spent their life around horses, the desperate whinny of an animal in distress. The sound came again, stronger this time, carried on a gust of bitter wind. John stood frozen on his porch, every instinct honed by decades of farming coming alert. That wasn't just any horse's cry. It was the distinct sound of a mare in distress. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and trudged through the deepening snow toward his property line. The beam cut through the swirling flakes, illuminating tracks that shouldn't have been there. Someone had driven a trailer down the old access road sometime in the night. "Hello?" His voice was swallowed by the wind. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour alone. Nothing should be out in this weather, let alone horses. The cry came a third time, weaker now. John quickened his pace, following the sound to the abandoned Anderson property. The old place had stood empty since Bill Anderson's death last spring, its fences falling and barn roof half collapsed. What he found there stopped his heart. 3 horses huddled against the deteriorating barn wall, trying to find shelter from the merciless wind. A mare, dark bay, and clearly undernourished, stood protectively over 2 foals that couldn't have been more than 4 months old. Their ribs showed clearly through frost-covered coats, and their eyes held the dull look of animals who had given up hope. "Dear God," John whispered, approaching slowly. The mare's head came up, eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. One of the foals lay in the snow, barely moving, the other pressed against its mother's leg, shivering violently. Fresh tire tracks told the story. Someone had brought these horses here in the night and simply left them. No hay, no water, no shelter, just 3 lives abandoned to the mercy of the worst storm in decades. John's hands shook as he reached for his phone to call Sarah Chen. The mare watched him warily, but didn't move away. She was too weak, too cold, to even consider flight. Up close, John could see old scars on her flanks, signs of systematic neglect that had started long before this night. "Sarah, it's John Miller. I need you out here now. Someone's dumped 3 horses on the Anderson place. 2 foals, both critical. Yeah, I know the storm's coming. That's why we don't have much time." The younger foal tried to stand but collapsed, back into the snow. Its mother nickered softly, a sound of such profound despair that John felt tears freezing on his cheeks. He knew what Sarah would say before she arrived. These horses needed immediate shelter, or they wouldn't survive the next few hours. The wind picked up, driving snow and ice horizontally across the fields. The temperature was still dropping. Weather. Radar showed the main storm front less than 3 hours away. When that hit, Nothing exposed would survive. John looked back toward his farm, toward those empty horse stalls he'd been avoiding for 5 years. He had barely enough hay for his own livestock. The vet bills would be enormous. The horses' owners might come back, causing legal troubles he couldn't afford. Every practical consideration screamed at him to wait for Sarah, to let the authorities handle this. It wasn't his problem. He had enough troubles without taking on 3 abandoned horses in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember. The foal in the snow had stopped shivering. A bad sign. Its sibling nuzzled it weakly, while their mother pressed against them both, trying to share what little warmth she had left. They were a family, fighting together, dying together. John remembered Emma's words about horses teaching us about freedom. But maybe, he thought, they also teach us about humanity, about the choices that define not just who we are, but who we want to be. He made his decision. "Come on, girl," he said softly to the mare, approaching with slow, careful movements. "Let's get you and your babies somewhere warm." The mare's eyes met his, and in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both survivors, both fighting against odds that seemed insurmountable. Behind him, the empty stalls in his barn waited. Ahead of him lay choices that would change lives, his and theirs. The storm was coming, and time was running out. John Miller took a deep breath of frozen air and began the work of saving 3 lives, knowing it might cost him everything he had left. John's hands trembled as he unlocked the tack room for the first time in 5 years. The musty smell of leather and memories hit him hard. Everything remained exactly as he'd left it. Emma's favorite saddle still hanging in its place, her riding, boots gathering dust in the corner. As he gathered lead ropes for the abandoned horses, his mind drifted back to that last summer. Emma had been so alive then, her chestnut hair catching the sunlight as she worked with their yearlings in the training ring. The Miller farm had been known for its quarter horses, breeding stock that combined good bloodlines with the kind of steady temperament that made them perfect for working ranches. "Storms coming," he muttered to himself, fighting back the memories. But they came anyway, as persistent as the approaching weather. It had started with a cough. Emma insisted it was nothing, just a summer cold that wouldn't clear up. By the time they got the diagnosis, stage 4 lung cancer, it was already too late. The medical bills mounted faster than their insurance could handle. Each treatment meant selling another horse, watching their dreams disappear one trailer, load at a time. The last horse they sold was Promise, Emma's favorite mare. She'd bred and trained Promise herself, always saying that horse had an old soul in young legs. Emma had insisted on the sale, knowing the money would buy her a few more months. John could still hear Promise's confused whinnies as the trailer drove away, still see the tears freezing on Emma's face as she watched from the window. "We'll breed more horses," Emma had whispered that night. "When I'm better, we'll start again." But she never got better. The treatments bought time but not healing, and in the end, John had to sell the remaining horses just to keep the farm. The day after Emma's funeral, he'd locked this tack room and walked away from the part of farming that had brought them the most joy. A sharp gust of wind rattled the barn doors, bringing John back to the present. He grabbed the lead ropes and basic medical supplies they'd once used in their breeding operation. The old horse blankets might be moth-eaten, but they'd be better than nothing for the freezing animals waiting in the storm. His phone buzzed, Sarah Chen calling back. "John, I'm stuck at the Gregory place. Cow in labor, breech birth. It'll be at least 2 hours before I can get to you." "They don't have 2 hours, Sarah. I know. Look, if you're thinking of taking them in." She hesitated. "John, you need to understand the legal implications. If someone dumped those horses, there's probably a reason. Getting involved could bring trouble you don't need." He looked at Emma's saddle, remembering her words about horses teaching freedom. But they taught other things too, about responsibility, about doing what's right even when it hurt. Sarah, Emma would never have left them out there. A long pause. No, she wouldn't have. Okay, listen carefully. Here's what you need to check when you bring them in. As Sarah detailed immediate care instructions, John gathered supplies with mechanical efficiency. Each item he touched brought back memories. The foaling kit they'd used for countless spring. Berths, the medicine cabinet where Emma had kept her meticulous records. The grooming tools, still arranged exactly as she'd left them. The wind howled outside, growing stronger. In its voice, John almost thought he could hear Emma urging him on. She'd always said God never puts more in your path than you can handle, though sometimes you needed help carrying the load. You were right, Em, he whispered, closing the tack room door. About horses teaching us things. Maybe it's time I started learning again. He stepped out into the storm, supplies in hand, ready to reopen a chapter of his life he thought he'd closed forever. The empty stalls wouldn't be empty much longer, and with that thought came something he hadn't felt in 5 years. A sense of purpose, of rightness, despite all the practical reasons to walk away. Behind him, Emma's saddle caught the dim light, its leather gleaming like a promise kept. The thermometer dropped another 3 degrees in the time it took John to return to the abandoned horses. -27 now, with the real storm still approaching. The younger foal hadn't moved from its spot in the snow, while its sibling struggled weakly to stay standing. "Easy now," John murmured, approaching the mare. Her ears flicked forward at his voice, but exhaustion had dulled her fear. Up close, the situation was even worse than he'd first thought. Ice had formed on their eyelashes and muzzles. Their bodies had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign that hypothermia was setting in. Following Sarah's instructions, John draped a lead rope over the mare's neck. She accepted it without resistance, too cold to fight. The real challenge would be the foals. The standing one might be able to walk, but its sibling— "Come on, little one," he urged, touching the fallen foal's neck. Its pulse was there, but weak and irregular. Even if he got them to the barn, there was no guarantee they'd survive the night. His phone's weather alert buzzed. Extreme weather warning. Temperature expected to drop to -40 with wind chill. All exposed livestock at critical risk. The mare nickered softly as John slipped the horse blanket over her back. It was old and smelled of mothballs, but her shivering intensified. A good sign, her body remembering how to fight the cold. "Your baby's next," he told her, moving to the standing foal. It took the blanket without protest, pressing against its mother. But when John tried to rouse its sibling, the foal barely responded. Time for desperate measures. John handed the mare's lead rope to his left hand and bent to scoop up the fallen foal. It was lighter than it should have been, severely malnourished beneath its winter coat. The mare watched anxiously, but seemed to understand his intentions. "My barn's just through these fields," he said, though whether he was reassuring the horses or himself, he wasn't sure. 500 yards, we can make it." They started moving, each step a battle against deepening snow and strengthening wind. The mare followed willingly, her standing foal pressed against her side. John's arms burned with the weight of the other foal, but he didn't dare stop. The temperature was still dropping. Halfway to the barn, the standing foal stumbled. John's heart clenched as it struggled to rise, its strength fading. The mare stopped, torn between following John with her injured foal and staying with her struggling one. "Come on," John urged. He couldn't carry them both. If they didn't reach the barn soon, all 4 of them risked freezing where they stood. The wind cut through his layers like knives. His fingers had gone numb, despite his gloves, and the foal in his arms felt colder by the second. The mare nudged her standing baby, encouraging it forward. One step at a time, they fought their way through the storm. John's own barn had never seemed so far away. His lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. The foal in his arms had grown still, too still. Only the faint movement of its chest assured him it was alive. Finally, the barn's outline emerged from the swirling snow. John had left the lights on, and their glow seemed like salvation. Just another 100 yards. Each step was a victory against the cold, against time, against death itself. His hands shook so badly he could barely work the barn door latch. When it finally swung open, the rush of relatively warmer air felt like summer. His cattle and pigs watched curiously as he led the horses to the empty stalls. The young foal in his arms was barely breathing. The other could barely stand. Even the mare swayed with exhaustion. They'd made it to shelter, but John knew the real fight was just beginning. As he reached for his phone to update Sarah, another weather alert flashed across the screen. Storm! Warning upgraded. Most severe winter weather event in 50 years approaching. All residents advised to seek immediate shelter. John looked at the 3 horses, now safely in his barn, but far from safe. The night ahead would determine not just their survival, but the consequences of his choice to help them. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the real storm hadn't even arrived yet. Inside the barn's relative warmth, reality hit John like a physical blow. The 3 horses occupied the last of his available space, and his feed supply, already stretched thin, would now have to stretch even further. Sarah's voice echoed in his head, listing immediate needs: warm water, electrolytes, careful refeeding to prevent colic. Each requirement represented another drain on his dwindling resources. The weaker foal lay motionless on the fresh straw he'd spread, its breathing shallow. Its sibling hadn't moved from their mother's side, both still shivering as their bodies slowly warmed. John's hands trembled as he checked his feed bins, 3 days' worth of hay for his existing animals, now divided by 3 more mouths. His phone rang. Tom Wheeler, his feed supplier. John, Storm's forcing early closure, last chance for delivery until it passes. John closed his eyes, mental calculations burning through his mind. The feed bill was already 2 months overdue. Asking for more would mean deeper debt, maybe even accelerate the bank's threats of foreclosure. Need about 3 days extra hay, he found himself saying. And some senior feed if you've got it. Pause on the line. John, about your outstanding balance. I know, Tom, but I've got animals that'll die without it. Another pause, longer this time. Tom had known Emma, had seen their horse operation in its prime. I'll send double what you asked for. We'll figure out the payment later. Relief flooded. Through John, immediately followed by shame. Another debt, another obligation he couldn't afford. The mare watched him with knowing eyes as he hung up, as if understanding the cost of his kindness. His moment of reflection was interrupted by a weak sound from the fallen foal. Its temperature was dangerously low, despite the barn's warmth. John retrieved Emma's old foaling kit, finding the emergency supplies Sarah had described. Each item he touched carried memories. Emma's careful labeling, her meticulous organization. Mare nickered anxiously as he worked with her foal, her own condition clearly deteriorating. Years of experience told John she was running on pure maternal instinct, pushing her body far beyond its limits to protect her babies. Working quickly, he mixed electrolytes in warm water. The mare drank eagerly, but getting the foals to take fluids was harder. The stronger one managed a few sips with coaxing. Its sibling could barely lift its head. A blast of wind rattled the barn doors. The storm was intensifying, and with it, the reality of his situation grew clearer. These horses needed more than just shelter. They needed veterinary care, special feed, medication, expenses that could push his precarious finances over the edge. The bank notice lay unopened in his kitchen, but he knew what it said. 3 missed payments, 1 last warning before foreclosure. Proceedings. Taking in these horses wasn't just an act of kindness. It was potentially the final blow to his struggle to keep the farm. His phone buzzed again. A text from Sarah. Highways closed. Can't get there until storm passes. Critical. Next 12 hours. Keep them warm, small amounts of water. Watch for signs of organ failure in the little one. John looked around his barn, at the careful organization of limited resources now stretched beyond breaking. His cattle needed their feed, his pigs their care. Adding 3 horses, especially in their condition, the weaker foal suddenly convulsed, its body fighting against the cold that had seeped into its bones. John dropped to his knees beside it, cradling its head as Emma had taught him years ago. The mare pressed against the stall bars, trying to reach her baby. "I know, girl," he whispered. "We're in this together now." Outside, the wind rose to a howl that sounded almost like Emma's voice, reminding him of words she'd once said. Sometimes the poorest man can give the richest gift, a chance at life. John Miller, facing bankruptcy and foreclosure, watched the sunset through his barn windows and made another choice. He would find a way, whatever it cost. These horses hadn't given up, and neither would he. Dawn broke over a transformed world. The storm had dumped nearly 2 feet of snow, and temperatures remained dangerously low. John had spent the night in the barn, catching moments of sleep between checking on the horses and tending to his other animals. The weaker foal had made it through the night, but just barely. His phone had been buzzing since sunrise. Word spread fast in small farming communities, and his decision to take in the abandoned horses had already become local news. Some messages offered support, others warned of consequences. Miller's lost his mind, read a text from Earl Davidson, whose corporate farm dominated the county's eastern edge. "Those horses are someone's property. You're asking for trouble." The feed delivery arrived mid-morning, Tom Wheeler's son fighting through snowdrifts with their ancient truck. The boy's eyes widened at the sight of the horses. Dad said to tell, "You not to worry about payment till spring," he said, unloading twice the amount John had requested. "He also said to give you these." He handed over several bags of specialized feed supplements, expensive stuff designed for rehabilitating malnourished horses. John's throat tightened. "Tell your father—" "He knows," the boy interrupted. "Mom's already started a collection at church. Said it's about time someone stood up for what's right." Before John could respond, Sarah Chen's truck appeared in the distance, finally free. From her emergency call, the vet looked exhausted but determined as she trudged through the snow to the barn. Her examination of the horses was thorough and grim. Severe malnutrition, possible organ damage from the cold. The mare's at least 300 pounds underweight. Whoever had them wasn't just neglecting them, this was deliberate abuse. "Can they make it?" Sarah's face softened. "Thanks to you, they have a chance. But John—" She hesitated. "I'm legally required to report abuse cases. Once I file the paperwork, people will start asking questions. Are you ready for that?" As if on cue, John's phone rang. Betty Wilson from the local paper. News traveled fast, and she wanted the story. John declined to comment, but Betty's next words chilled him. "Someone's already talking, John. Man over in Pearson County claims. Those are his horses. Says they were stolen last week. He's threatening legal action." The mare nickered softly, drawing John's attention. She stood protectively over her foals, trust beginning to show in eyes that had known only fear. The stronger foal had managed to nurse, while its sibling showed small signs of improvement. "John," Sarah interrupted his thoughts, "I've got rapports to file. Want my honest advice? Document everything, take photos, keep records. Something tells me you're going to need proof of their condition when you found them." More vehicles appeared on the road, neighbors curious about the story spreading through their community. Some, like old Bill Jenkins, came with offerings. A spare heat lamp, some leftover medications from his own horses. Others just watched from their trucks, judging. Maggie from the diner showed up with hot coffee and breakfast. "Don't you listen to them gossips," she said firmly. "Emma would be proud of what you're doing." But not everyone shared Maggie's support. By afternoon, John had received calls from 3 different lawyers, each warning him about the legal implications of harboring possibly stolen horses. The bank left another message. They'd heard about his new livestock acquisition and wanted to discuss his loan status immediately. Through it all, John kept working. The mare needed near-constant care, her rehabilitation complicated by years of neglect. The foals required careful monitoring, especially the weaker one, which still couldn't stand without help. "Your mama's fighting for you," he told the little one as he helped it nurse. "And so are we." Sarah finished her examination and paperwork, her expression troubled. "I've never seen abuse this severe. John, when this gets out, it's going to cause an uproar. Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" Looking at the horses, John thought of Emma, of promises kept and broken. "Doesn't matter if I'm ready," he said quietly. "Sometimes you don't choose the fight, it chooses you." As Sarah left, more vehicles appeared on the road. Word was spreading faster now, and with it came the first hints of the storm that had nothing to do with weather. A storm of controversy, accusation and conflict that would test not just John's resolve, but the very heart of their farming community. Sarah Chen returned the next morning with her full medical kit and a grim determination. The preliminary examination had only scratched the surface. Now, as winter sunlight filtered through the barn windows, every new discovery told a story of prolonged cruelty. "These aren't just neglect injuries," Sarah said, running her hands over the mare's flanks. "See these scars, consistent with barbed wire containment. They kept her in a makeshift pen, probably to hide her from view." She pointed to distinct marks on the horse's legs. "And these? Chain marks. They kept her tethered, probably while she was pregnant." John's fists clenched. The mare stood quietly during the examination, but her eyes still showed traces of fear whenever someone moved too quickly. Trust came slowly to animals who'd known only betrayal. "She's young," Sarah continued, checking the mare's teeth. "Maybe 6 or 7. Been bred at least 3 times before these foals, judging by the wear on her body. Probably a puppy mill situation, but with horses, breeding her every chance they got, selling the foals quick." The stronger foal nickered, pressing against its mother. Sarah's examination of the foals revealed more horrors. They're twins, which is rare and dangerous in horses. Explains their size. Mare couldn't properly sustain both during pregnancy. Whoever bred her knew the risks, but did it anyway. John remembered Emma's careful breeding program, how they'd monitored their mares, ensuring each pregnancy was safe and properly timed. This was the opposite, exploitation pure and simple. Sarah took blood samples, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. The weaker foals showing signs of heart murmur. Could be from the cold exposure, could be congenital. Either way, treatment's going to be expensive. How expensive? Sarah hesitated. "John, being straight with you, we're looking at thousands minimum. They'll need specialized feed, medical treatments, possibly surgery for the little one. And that's assuming everything goes right." As if understanding they were talking about it, the weaker foal struggled to its feet. Its legs trembled with the effort, but something in its eyes showed the same determination John had seen in its mother. A will to live despite everything. "There's something else," Sarah said, checking her phone. "I did some digging after yesterday's exam. Found some chatter on veterinary networks about a horse breeding operation shut down in Oklahoma 3 months ago. Details match. Mare with similar markings, reports of illegal breeding practices. But here's the thing, they never found all the horses." She showed John a photo. The mare in the image was their rescue, but healthier, before whatever hell she'd endured. They were breeding quarter horses, selling foals with fake papers. When authorities moved in, some horses vanished, probably sold quick to cover tracks, and our claiming owner in Pearson County. If he's who I think he is, he's connected to the Oklahoma operation, which means he's not getting these horses back, John finished, his voice hard. Sarah nodded, grimly. "I'm forwarding everything to the state veterinary board and animal welfare authorities." "But John," She paused, choosing her words carefully. These people, they're not just small-time crooks. This is organized crime in the horse world. They'll fight to protect their operation. The mare chose that moment to nuzzle John's shoulder, leaving a warm breath against his neck. Her trust, so fragile and new, felt like both a gift and a responsibility. The little one's heart condition, Sarah continued, packing her medical supplies. Treatment might buy time, but there's no guarantee. You need to be prepared. For whatever comes, John said quietly. I know. Outside, more cars were gathering. Word of the abuse findings would spread fast. The mayor's story would outrage some, threaten others. Lines would be drawn in their small community between those who wanted justice and those who preferred to look away. I'll file the reports today, Sarah said, heading for her truck. Once they go public, she didn't need to finish. They both knew this was about to become bigger than one farmer trying to save 3 horses. John watched her drive away, then turned back to the horses. The mare met his gaze steadily, no longer showing fear. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. Emma had always said horses choose their people as much as people choose horses. Looking at the mare and her foals, John understood. Sometimes the choices that cost the most were the ones most worth making. The Millbrook Diner had served as the community's unofficial town hall for 3 generations. Now, 5 days after John's rescue of the horses, it became the battleground for a growing conflict. Maggie's usual breakfast crowd had split into clear factions, their heated discussions drowning out the clatter of coffee cups. Man's got no right keeping property that ain't his, Earl Davidson declared from his usual corner booth. Law's the law. If someone claims those horses, Miller needs to hand them over. Property? Maggie snapped, slamming down his coffee refill. Those animals were freezing to death. Where was their owner then? The diner's door chimed as Sarah Chen entered, carrying files from her latest examination. The conversation hushed. Briefly, everyone knew the vet's reports had sparked investigations beyond their small community. How's the little one doing? Tom Wheeler asked, making space for her at the counter. Fighting, Sarah replied, accepting coffee. But that's not why I'm here. She spread several documents on the counter. Got the blood work back? Evidence of multiple drugs in the mare's system, fertility medications, illegal performance enhancers. Whoever ran this operation was doing more than just backyard breeding. The diner erupted in fresh debate. Some, like Tom Wheeler and his church group, saw it as confirmation they needed to support John. Others, particularly those with ties to larger agricultural operations, grew notably quiet. Ain't our business, muttered Frank Cooper, whose corporate farm shared a border with the Davidsons. Start poking into other folks' operations. Might not like what comes back. The bell chimed again. John himself entered, looking exhausted after another night watching over the weaker foal. The conversation stuttered to silence. John, Maggie called out, already pouring his usual coffee, was just about to call you. Betty Wilson's article hit the morning paper. The front page headline read, Local farmer uncovers alleged horse. Abuse ring. State authorities investigate claims of criminal breeding operation. There's more, Sarah said quietly, sliding a document across the counter. State vet boards linking cases across 3 states. These people, they're connected. That man claiming ownership, he's got a record. Animal abuse charges in Texas, fraud in Oklahoma. All the more reason to stay clear, Earl Davidson interrupted. Miller, you're painting a target on all of us. These people want their horses back. Give 'em back. Let the authorities handle the rest. Like they handled it in Oklahoma? Tom Wheeler stood, his usual gentle manner hardening. Where these same folks disappeared with horses before they could be seized. That what you want, Earl? Send those animals back to be abused, maybe killed. The diner had grown tense, years of neighborly relationships straining under the weight of moral choices. John noticed some wouldn't meet his eyes, while others nodded encouragement. "Got calls from 3 feed suppliers this morning," Frank Cooper announced, "all asking questions about our operations, talking about new oversight procedures. This investigation of yours is making life harder for every farmer in the county." "Maybe it should," Maggie shot back. "Maybe we've all looked away too long." John's phone buzzed, another message from the bank. The investigation had made them nervous, accelerating their demands. He had 1 week to make his overdue payments, or face immediate foreclosure. Sarah noticed his expression. "John, what aren't you telling us?" Before he could answer, Betty Wilson rushed in, clutching her phone. "Just got a tip. That claiming owner, he's not just filing for custody, he's suing for damages, claiming theft and defamation. Named John, Sarah, even the paper as defendants." The diner fell silent. Everyone knew John couldn't afford his existing bills, let alone a legal battle. "Time to cut your losses," Earl Davidson said, almost gently. "Save your farm, Miller. Let the horses go." John looked around the diner at faces he'd known his whole life. Some showed support, others fear, many simple resignation to what they saw as inevitable. "Emma used to say," he spoke finally, his quiet voice carrying in the silence, "that character isn't about the fights we choose. It's about standing our ground when the fight chooses us." He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. "Those horses aren't going back to abuse, not while I have breath to fight. Anyone who wants to stand with me, welcome. Anyone who doesn't," he met Earl Davidson's eyes, "might want to ask yourself why." The diner's bell chimed a final time as John left. Through the windows, they watched him drive back to his farm, back to 3 horses who represented either his salvation or his ruin. The battle lines were drawn. In the days ahead, their community would have to choose sides in a fight that was about much more than 3 abandoned horses. It was about who they were, what they stood for, and what they were willing to sacrifice for what was right. The crisis began at midnight. John had been dozing in the barn's makeshift office when the mare's distressed nickering jolted him awake. The weaker foal had collapsed, its breathing labored and irregular. "No, no, no," John muttered, scrambling for his phone to call Sarah. His fingers shook as he dialed, watching the foal's chest heave with each struggled breath. The heart condition she'd warned about was getting worse. "Temperature's dropping," Sarah said when he described the symptoms. "Could be putting extra strain on its heart. I'm on my way, but John, it's going to be close." The mare paced anxiously, sensing her baby's distress. Her stronger foal pressed against the stall bars, watching with eerily intelligent eyes as John worked to save its sibling. Following Sarah's instructions, John wrapped the foal in warm blankets, monitoring its pulse. Each beat felt weaker than the last. Outside, the winter wind howled, and his phone's weather alert warned of another approaching storm. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, cradling the foal's head in his lap. Its eyes, so much like its mother's, met his with a trust that broke his heart. He'd promised these horses safety, promised them a future. Now that promise hung by a thread. The mare's soft knickers became more insistent. She knew. Mothers always knew when their babies were slipping away. John remembered Emma sitting up with their sick foals, singing softly through endless nights. He found himself humming the same lullabies, his voice rough with emotion. "Your mama's here," he told the struggling foal. "I'm here. We're not giving up." 2 hours crawled by. The foal's breathing grew more labored. John alternated between prayers and quiet encouragement, remembering every horse they'd lost, every battle against death that had ended in defeat. Sarah arrived at 2 a.m., medical, kit in hand. Her expression tightened when she saw the foal's condition. "Heart's failing," she confirmed after a quick examination. "We can try medication, but John, you need to be prepared." The mare watched intently as Sarah prepared the injection. She'd come to trust them over the past days, understanding somehow that they were trying to help, even if we save it tonight, Sarah said quietly, administering the medicine, the heart condition. This could happen again, and the treatment costs... Don't, John cut her off. Not tonight. Tonight we just fight. Another hour passed. The medication seemed to help slightly. The foal's breathing eased, though its pulse remained weak. Sarah monitored its vital signs while John kept it warm and comfortable. "Tell me about them," she said during a quiet moment. "Your horses before, Emma's favorites." John smiled faintly, remembering. She loved the difficult ones best. Said they had the most to teach us about patience, about not giving up. He looked at the mare, standing vigilant over her sick baby. Like this one, Emma would have loved her spirit. The foal stirred slightly, pressing into John's touch. Outside, the wind began to ease, and the first hints of dawn lightened the sky. "John," Sarah said softly, checking the foal's vitals again, I think we're through the worst. Pulse is stronger, breathing stabilizing." The mare seemed to sense the change, her posture relaxing slightly. Her other foal whinnied softly as if celebrating. "But you know this isn't over," Sarah warned, packing her medical supplies. "The heart condition, the legal threats, the cost of ongoing care." John watched the sun rise through his barn windows, painting the world in shades of hope. The foal had survived the night, defying odds just as its mother had done in that deadly storm. "Emma used to say every sunrise is a second chance," he said quietly. "These horses survived hell to get here, survived abuse, abandonment, freezing cold. They're fighters." He met Sarah's concerned gaze. "And so am I." The mare gently nuzzled her recovering baby, then turned to press her head against John's shoulder. In that moment of connection, he felt Emma's presence stronger than ever. Some battles were worth fighting, whatever the cost. Dawn broke fully over the farm, bringing with it new challenges, new threats. But for now, in the quiet of his barn, John Miller had won the most important fight, keeping a promise, saving a life, standing his ground when it would have been easier to give up. The war was far from over, but this battle, this night, belonged to hope. Betty Wilson's article didn't just stay in their local paper. By noon, 3 major news networks had picked up the story. John's quiet farm became the center of a social media storm when Sarah's photos of the rescued horses went viral. "You need to see this," Tom Wheeler said, hurrying into the barn with his tablet. Local discussion groups had exploded with support. People were sharing their own stories of horse abuse, of looking the other way, of wishing they'd done more. John, exhausted from the night's vigil, watched in amazement as messages poured in from across the country. A retired veterinarian from Texas offered specialized medical supplies. A feed company in Oklahoma wanted to donate 3 months of rehabilitation. Feed. A legal firm specializing in animal welfare cases reached out, offering to take on their case pro bono. "It's not just messages," Sarah added, showing him her phone. "People are organizing. Someone started a fundraiser for the medical bills. It hit $10,000 in the first hour." The mare and her foals had become symbols of something larger, a fight against abuse, against looking the other way, against letting money dictate morality. Each share, each comment, each donation represented someone choosing to stand up. "John Miller," a woman's voice called from outside. Lisa Martinez, from the state's largest news channel, stood in the snow with her camera crew. "We'd like to tell your story. Show people what real courage looks like." The interview was simple, honest. John spoke from his heart about finding the horses, about choosing to help despite the costs. When they filmed the mare gently nuzzling her recovering foal, even the hardened camera operator wiped away tears. "You risked everything," Lisa said, gesturing to the farm. "Your livelihood, your future." Why? John thought of Emma, of promises, kept and broken. Because some things matter more than money. Sometimes you have to stand up, even when standing up might cost you everything. The story aired that evening. By nightfall, the fundraiser had passed $50,000. Messages of support overwhelmed John's phone. Farmers offering hay, veterinarians offering services, ordinary people wanting to help. "Look at this," Tom Wheeler said, showing another message. Local riders were organizing a protest at the courthouse, demanding justice for the horses and investigation into the broader abuse ring. Even some of John's critics began to shift. Earl Davidson's wife arrived with fresh baked bread and an envelope of cash collected at their church. "Earl's still Earl," she said quietly, "but he's not sleeping well. None of us are since we saw those photos." The mare seemed to sense the change in energy. She stood prouder now, as if knowing she'd become more than just a rescued horse. Her story was inspiring people to look harder, speak up, take action. Sarah arrived with more news. State Attorney General's office called. They're opening a formal investigation into the breeding operation. Our evidence, combined with the public pressure, they can't ignore this anymore. The stronger foal pranced in its stall, gaining strength. Daily, its sibling, though still weak, showed the same fighting spirit that had helped it survive the night. The mare watched over them both, her eyes now holding trust instead of fear. "Emma would be proud," Maggie said, delivering dinner to the barn, not just of saving them, but of showing people that one person can make a difference, that standing up matters. As evening fell, John sat with his rescued family, reading messages from strangers who'd been moved to act, to donate, to fight for change in their own communities. His bank account might be empty, but his heart was full. Sometimes the richest gifts come in unexpected ways, not in what we gain, but in what we inspire others to become. The brown envelope arrived with Sarah's morning mail. Inside, the Oklahoma investigators' report painted a picture darker than anyone had imagined. The mare's DNA results matched a champion quarter-horse bloodline, stolen 3 years ago from a prestigious breeding farm. They didn't just abuse them, Sarah explained, spreading documents across John's kitchen table. They were running a sophisticated fraud operation, stealing valuable breeding stock, producing foals with fake papers, selling them to unsuspecting buyers. Photos showed the operation's base, a remote compound with hidden breeding stalls and makeshift surgery facilities. The authorities had found drugs used to force breeding cycles, equipment for forging registration papers, and evidence of dozens of horses moved through the system. "Your mare wasn't the only one," Sarah continued, her voice tight. "They had at least 20 breeding females at one point. When the Oklahoma raid happened, 8 horses vanished overnight. She was one of them." John studied a photograph of the compound's interior, the chains they'd used, the cruel efficiency of their setup, all designed to maximize profit without regard for the animal's suffering. His mare's scars told only part of the story. "There's more," Sarah said quietly, pulling out another document. "That man claiming ownership, James Tucker, he's not just connected to the operation. According to this, he ran it, changed his name, moved between states, but the pattern's the same." A knock at the door interrupted them. Agent Monica Reynolds from the State Bureau of Investigation stood on the porch, her badge catching the winter sunlight. "Mr. Miller," she said, entering. "We've been building a case against Tucker's organization for months. Your rescue of these horses, you've given us the break we needed." She laid out surveillance photos showing Tucker meeting with known criminal figures. The horse operation was part of a larger money laundering scheme, using the illegal breeding program to clean dirty money. "These people," Agent Reynolds warned, "they're not just rural criminals. They have connections, resources, and they're desperate to recover those horses before they can be used as evidence." As if understanding they were talking about her, the mare nickered from the barn. Through the window, John could see her watching the house, protective as ever over her foals. Tucker's operation made millions, Reynolds continued. We've traced sales across 12 states. But proving it requires physical evidence, DNA matches, documentation of abuse, living victims that can connect him to the crimes. Like our horses, Sarah realized. Exactly. Your mare and those foals. They're not just rescue animals anymore. They're key witnesses in what could be the largest animal trafficking case in state history. John's phone buzzed. Another threat from Tucker's lawyer demanding the horse's return. Now he understood the desperation behind their legal maneuvers. It wasn't about property rights. It was about covering their tracks. We can protect you, Reynolds offered. Witness protection programs aren't just for people. We can move the horses to a secure facility. No, John cut her off, watching his mare in the barn. She's been moved enough, suffered enough. This is her home now. We'll protect her here. Reynolds studied him thoughtfully. You understand what you're taking on. These people, they don't give up easily. Through the window, John watched the mare guide her foals into the winter sunlight, their movements stronger each day. They'd survived hell to find safety here. He wouldn't let anyone take that from them. Let them come, he said quietly. Some things are worth fighting for. Sarah gathered the documents, her expression grim. I'll alert my network of vets. If Tucker's people try to move other horses, we'll be watching. As Agent Reynolds left, she paused at her car. The press attention, the social media support, it's rattled them. They're used to operating in shadows. Now everyone's watching. John nodded, understanding. The truth about these horses had become a spotlight, illuminating dark corners where cruelty had flourished unchecked. The real fight was just beginning. The sheriff's deputy looked uncomfortable delivering the court papers. 3 separate documents, an emergency custody order for the horses, a cease and desist demanding John stop all public statements about their condition, and a lawsuit claiming $2 million in damages for defamation and loss of valuable breeding stock. They're trying to bury you in legal fees, Sarah said, reviewing the papers with John at the kitchen table. Tucker's lawyers filed in 3 different jurisdictions. Fighting this could take years. The mayor's worried nickering drew their attention. To the window, 3 black SUVs had parked at the farm's entrance, their tinted windows concealing the occupants. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the first vehicle, flanked by 2 others who carried themselves like security. That's Tucker, Sarah whispered, recognizing him from the investigation photos. He's not supposed to be within 1,000 yards of the horses. Court order from the Oklahoma case. John's hand tightened on the papers. Through the window, he could see Tucker surveying the farm like a man examining property he already owned. The 2 men with him moved with military precision, noting camera positions and entry points. Mr. Miller, Tucker's voice carried across the snow-covered yard. Let's talk business. Make this easy on everyone. John stepped onto his porch, Sarah close behind. Up close, Tucker's smile reminded John of a snake, all cold calculation behind false charm. Your legal position is weak, Tucker said, without preamble. Those are my horses with documentation to prove it, but I'm willing to be reasonable. Name your price. They're not for sale. Tucker's smile tightened. Everything's for sale. Your farm's 3 payments behind, banks ready to foreclose. I could solve all your problems right now. He pulled out a checkbook. How much? $500,000? $1 million? The mare's anxious whinnying grew louder. She could sense the threat, even from the barn. One of her foals joined in, their combined voices carrying fear and defiance. You hear that? John said quietly. They remember you. Remember what you did to them. Tucker's facade cracked slightly. Careful, Miller. Right now this is business. Don't make it personal. Personal? Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaking with rage. Like the chains you used, the drugs you pumped into them, the foals you sold before they were weaned. Allegations, Tucker snapped. Unprovable ones, but lawsuits, those are very provable, very expensive. How long can you fight, Miller? How much can you lose? As if on cue, John's phone buzzed. Another bank notice. Tucker smiled, knowing what it meant. Last chance. Take the money. Sign them over. Walk away rich instead of bankrupt. John looked at the check, at the amount that could solve all his financial problems. Then he looked at the barn, where 3 survivors of cruelty waited, trusting him to protect them. "Here's my offer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Leave my property, stay away from my horses, or I'll make sure. Every piece of evidence, every photo, every medical record goes public. Not through lawyers, through people, thousands of them, all watching now, all ready to share your story." Tucker's smile vanished. "You really want this fight?" "No," John replied, "but I'm ready for it." The mare's defiant whinny punctuated his words. Tucker glanced at the barn, then at his phone showing mounting social media pressure. His operation thrived in shadows, but John had dragged it into the light. "This isn't over," Tucker warned, retreating to his vehicle. "Not by a long shot." As the SUVs pulled away, Sarah let out a shaky breath. "They'll be back, with lawyers, with court orders, with whatever it takes." John watched Tucker's vehicles disappear down the snow-covered road. Let them come. Some things matter more than money. Some fights choose you. Inside the barn, the mare quieted, sensing the immediate threat had passed. But John knew Tucker was right about one thing. This wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. The pro bono legal team arrived at dawn, led by Catherine Martinez, a former prosecutor who dedicated her career to fighting animal abuse rings. She spread photos and documents across John's kitchen table, building their counter-strategy. "Tucker made a mistake coming here personally," she explained, reviewing security footage from John's cameras. "Violated his Oklahoma restraining order. Now we can file for emergency protective orders in this jurisdiction too." Sarah added her medical evidence to the growing pile. Complete documentation of abuse, DNA matches to stolen breeding stock, proof of forced breeding practices. Every scar tells a story, but their strongest weapon emerged unexpectedly. Betty Wilson arrived breathless, clutching her laptop. "You need to see this." She pulled up social media feeds showing something extraordinary. People across the country posting photos of horses they'd bought from Tucker's operation, many with health issues and forged papers. "It's a chain reaction," Betty explained. "Your story made them brave enough to come forward. Tucker didn't just hurt your horses, he built an empire on suffering, and now his victims are speaking out." Catherine's eyes lit up. "This changes everything. Each case strengthens our position. We're not just defending against his lawsuit anymore. We're building a class action." The mare nickered from the barn, drawing their attention. Through the window, they could see her standing proudly in the winter sunlight, her foals growing stronger each day. They weren't just survivors now. They were evidence of crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. "Tucker's lawyers filed in 3 jurisdictions hoping to drain your resources," Catherine continued. "But they didn't count on public support. We've got offers from legal teams in 12 states, all willing to help. Every time they file a motion, we'll be ready." John's phone buzzed with a new message. The bank. But this time, it wasn't a threat. The social media campaign had reached them too, along with hundreds of calls from supporters. They were offering to restructure his loan, citing extraordinary circumstances. "Look at this," Sarah added, checking her veterinary network. 3 more horses, matching DNA from Tucker's stolen stock, just turned up in Texas. Witnesses are coming forward with shipping records, fake documentation trails. The strategy session was interrupted by the rumble of engines. Through the windows, they watched a convoy of horse trailers pulling up. Tom Wheeler led the group, followed by riders from 3 counties. "Heard Tucker's people might try something," Tom said simply. "Thought you could use some eyes on the place. We'll take shifts." Catherine smiled. "Perfect. Witnesses, documentation. They can't claim the horses are being mistreated here if we have independent observers round the clock. More supporters arrived throughout the day. Maggie brought food for the volunteers. Local kids set up a live stream of the barn, ensuring any attempts to seize the horses would be broadcast instantly. Each person who arrived carried the same message. Not this time, not these horses. We're not just fighting Tucker's legal moves, Catherine explained as evening fell. We're fighting his whole system, the secrecy, the intimidation, the way he made people too afraid to speak up. That ends now. The mare watched the activity from her stall, no longer showing fear at the presence of strangers. She seemed to understand that each person who arrived stood between her family and those who had hurt them. John's phone rang. Agent Reynolds updating him on the investigation. Tucker's empire was crumbling as more evidence emerged. Former employees were talking, hoping to make deals before the whole operation collapsed. They thought they could bury this story in legal papers, Betty said, updating her latest article. Instead, they've given it wings. Standing in his barn that evening, surrounded by supporters and watching his rescued horses rest peacefully, John finally felt the tide turning. Tucker had money, lawyers, and threats, but John had something stronger, truth, and an army of ordinary people ready to stand with him and fight. The county courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Hundreds of supporters filled the corridors, many wearing buttons with photos of John's rescued horses. Outside, news crews jostled for position as Tucker arrived with his legal team. Inside the courtroom, Catherine Martinez laid out their evidence methodically. Photos of the horse's condition flashed on screens, the scarring, the malnutrition, the physical proof of years of abuse. "Your Honor," she began, "these horses aren't just property in dispute. They're evidence of systematic criminal abuse, witnesses to crimes that span multiple states." Tucker's lead attorney, Richard Banks, rose smoothly. "My client has documentation, proving ownership. Whatever condition these animals were in when Mr. Miller found them, he had no right to take possession. This is a simple property dispute." Judge Marion Hayes studied the photos carefully. "Nothing about this seems simple. Counselor Dr. Chen, please approach." Sarah took the stand, her veterinary credentials impeccable. She walked through her findings clinically, professionally, but her voice shook when describing the foal's condition. The mare shows evidence of multiple forced breeding cycles, consistent with reproductive abuse. Chemical analysis found traces of illegal fertility drugs. The foal's developmental issues suggest in utero neglect. Banks attempted to discredit her testimony, suggesting bias. "Dr. Chen, you've known Mr. Miller for years. Can you truly be objective?" "I can be professional," Sarah countered. "These medical facts don't require interpretation. The scar patterns, the blood work, the DNA matches to stolen breeding stock. They tell their own story." The courtroom stirred as Catherine presented their surprise evidence, testimony from a former worker at Tucker's operation, speaking via video link under witness protection. "We were ordered to breed them as often as possible," the witness stated. "When mares couldn't produce any more, they disappeared. Mr. Tucker personally supervised the disposal of—" "Objection!" Banks shot to his feet. "This testimony is prejudicial and irrelevant to the ownership dispute." "Your Honor," Catherine argued, "Mr. Tucker's treatment of other horses speaks directly to his fitness as an owner and the danger these animals would face if returned to his custody." Tucker sat stone-faced as more evidence mounted. Financial records showing suspicious cash flows, documentation of falsified breeding papers, photos matching John's mare to a champion quarter horse stolen 3 years ago. The turning point came when Agent Reynolds testified about the ongoing criminal investigation. Mr. Tucker isn't just seeking the return of these horses. He's attempting to recover and dispose of evidence crucial to a federal investigation into organized criminal activities. Through it all, John sat quietly, thinking of the mare and foals back at his farm, surrounded by supporters keeping watch. Everything he had rode on this hearing, his farm, his future, their lives. During a brief recess, Tucker approached him, in the hallway. "Not too late to deal, Miller. Name your price, walk away, or I'll make sure you lose everything." John met his eyes steadily. "You still don't understand. This stopped being about money the moment I found them freezing in that storm. Some things matter more." Back in session, Judge Hayes reviewed the mounting evidence with growing concern. Tucker's expensive legal team fought every point, but they couldn't counter the power of simple truth, backed by overwhelming documentation. "This court," Judge Hayes finally announced, "finds sufficient evidence to issue an immediate injunction. The horses will remain in Mr. Miller's protective custody, pending full criminal investigation into Mr. Tucker's activities." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but John noticed Tucker's slight smile as he whispered to his lawyers. This wasn't over, just shifting to a new phase. Catherine confirmed his fears outside. "They'll appeal, file new motions, try to drain our resources. And Tucker, men like him have other ways of solving problems." John nodded, already thinking of the long night ahead. One battle won, but the war was far from over. The horses were still at risk, and Tucker had just become more dangerous than ever. The warning came at midnight. Two of Tucker's former employees spotted heading toward the county line. Sarah's urgent call woke John from his first real sleep since the hearing. "They're not coming with lawyers this time," she warned. "Local. Sheriff caught one of them buying bolt cutters and sedatives. They're planning something tonight." John was already moving, pulling on his boots as he alerted their volunteer security network. Tom Wheeler's night watch team reported headlights on the back roads, vehicles moving without lights, trying to stay hidden. The mare sensed the tension, pacing her stall restlessly. Her foals, including the weaker one still recovering from its heart condition, pressed close to her. They'd survived so much, come so far. John wouldn't let them be taken now. "Got movement in the East Woods," crackled a report from one of the volunteers. "At least 3 people on foot. They're trying to flank the barn." Agent Reynolds had warned them this might happen. Tucker was facing federal indictment. The horses weren't just property anymore. They were evidence that could destroy him. Men like that didn't let evidence survive. The winter wind carried the sound of breaking branches. John's security cameras caught glimpses of dark figures moving through the trees. They were professionals, coordinated, dangerous. "Everyone stay. Calm," John broadcast to the volunteer network. "Law enforcement's been notified. Don't engage. Just observe and report." But the intruders had planned well. The farm's power suddenly cut out, plunging everything into darkness. The backup generator kicked in, but several security cameras were already down. "They're targeting the barn's north side," another volunteer reported. "Look like they're carrying tranquilizer guns, planning to drug the horses for transport." John's hands tightened on his phone. The mare's distressed whinnying echoed through the darkness. Her maternal instinct sensed the danger to her. "Foals. Multiple vehicles approaching from the county road," Tom Wheeler's voice crackled. "Box truck with a horse trailer. They're setting up for a quick extraction." The temperature was dropping rapidly, the winter night turning bitter. If they sedated the horses in this cold, moved them without proper protection, the foals might not survive the journey. That was probably the point. Tucker wouldn't want them found alive. "John," Sarah's voice shook with anger, "they're going to kill them. Maybe not directly, but moving them in these conditions, especially the little one with the heart condition." Sharp cracks split the night. Someone testing the barn's locks. The mare's panicked whinny was joined by distressed sounds from John's other animals. They all sensed the wrongness, the threat. But something else was happening. Headlights appeared on every approach road. Word had spread through social media, through the network of supporters they'd built. Farmers, ranchers, ordinary people who'd been following the story. They were coming. "Got 30 vehicles at least," Tom reported with growing excitement. "More. Arriving every minute." They're boxing in Tucker's team. The would-be raiders found themselves suddenly exposed, caught in the converging headlights of dozens of vehicles. Their carefully planned operation was falling apart as witnesses arrived from every direction, phones recording, horns blaring. Local sheriff's deputies appeared, followed by state police. Tucker's men melted away into the darkness, their attempt at forcible recovery thwarted by the very public attention they'd hoped to avoid. "This is what they don't understand," Sarah said, arriving to check on the horses. "They think it's just you they have to fight. But it's all of us now, every person who's tired of looking the other way, tired of letting cruelty win." The mare gradually calmed as the danger passed. Her foals, safe in their stall, hadn't fully grasped how close they'd come to being taken. John watched them through the night, knowing Tucker would try again. The man was cornered now, desperate, more dangerous than ever. But they weren't alone anymore. As dawn broke over the farm, dozens of supporters remained, standing guard. The horses had become more than just rescued animals. They were a symbol of hope, of standing up, of ordinary people saying enough to those who thought money and power put them above the law. The battle for their lives had become a battle for justice itself, and an entire community had chosen its side. The federal courthouse in Lincoln was packed beyond capacity. After Tucker's failed raid attempt, the judge had expedited the final hearing. Now everything would be decided. Not just the horse's fate, but the future of Tucker's entire operation. John sat with Catherine Martinez, watching Tucker's face as the prosecution presented their evidence. The failed raid had been the final straw, pushing federal authorities to move faster than planned. Now everything was coming to light. The government presents evidence that the defendant, James Tucker, operated a criminal enterprise spanning 5 states. The prosecutor announced. Theft of valuable breeding stock, fraudulent papers, illegal veterinary practices, and money. Laundering through horse sales. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed millions flowing through shell companies. Former employees testified about cruel breeding practices, about horses that disappeared when they stopped producing. DNA evidence connected John's mare to champions stolen years ago. Tucker's composed facade cracked as his former operation manager detailed their practices. "Mr. Tucker personally ordered us to chain the pregnant mares. Said it was cheaper than proper stalls. When that mare escaped during transport, he pointed to a photo of John's rescue. He ordered us to let her freeze, said dead horses tell no tales." Sarah's testimony about the horse's condition drew gasps from the gallery. The photographs were devastating. The scarring, the malnutrition, the foals' developmental issues from forced breeding. "And their current condition?" the prosecutor asked. Sarah smiled. "Thriving. The mare has regained her health. The stronger foal is completely recovered. And the little one—" She paused, emotion catching her voice. Despite the heart condition, despite everything they endured, that foal fought to live. They all did. They just needed someone to give them a chance. Tucker's lawyers tried to shift blame, argue technicalities, but the truth was too clear. When John took the stand, he spoke simply about finding them in the storm, about choosing to help despite the costs. "Mr. Miller," Tucker's lawyer pressed, "you had no legal right to take those horses." "No," John agreed, "just a moral one. Sometimes that matters more." The judge's deliberation was brief. His verdict fell like hammer blows. Tucker and his associates, guilty on all counts, the horses, officially awarded to John's custody, Tucker's assets seized for restitution to victims. A special fund established to care for other rescued horses, but the final blow came from an unexpected direction. Agent Reynolds approached Tucker with new warrants, evidence of similar operations in 3 other states. His empire wasn't just falling. It was exposing an entire network of abuse. Outside the courthouse, supporters cheered. The mare and her foals had become symbols of something larger, proof that standing up against cruelty mattered, that ordinary people could fight. Powerful interests and win. "It's over," Catherine said, hugging John. "Really over." But John was already thinking of home, of 3 survivors waiting in his barn. The legal battle was won, but their journey of healing would continue. And somehow that felt right. They would move forward together, each day a new victory over the darkness they'd escaped. Sarah met him at the farm that evening. The mare nickered a greeting, her foals strong and active beside her. They were different animals now, not just physically recovered, but spiritually transformed. Like their rescuer, they had fought against impossible odds and emerged stronger. "Emma would be so proud," Sarah said softly. John watched the sunset paint his barn in shades of hope. The bank had refinanced his loan. The community's support had secured his farm's future, but his greatest reward was seeing 3 horses, once destined for death, now running free in his pasture. Sometimes the richest victories aren't measured in money or power, but in the simple triumph of compassion over cruelty, of ordinary people choosing to do what's right, whatever the cost. Spring came early to the Miller farm. The mare and her foals grazed in green pastures that had once stood empty, their coats gleaming with health in the morning sun. The weaker foal, though smaller than its sibling, ran with surprising strength, its heart condition managed through careful treatment. John watched them from his porch, coffee in hand, remembering the frozen night that had changed everything. The mare lifted her head, nickering a greeting. She was a different animal now, confident, trusting, her eyes bright with life instead of fear. The changes went beyond his farm. Tucker's conviction had exposed similar operations across the country. New laws were being passed, stricter oversight implemented. Sarah had helped establish a network of veterinarians specifically trained to identify and document abuse cases. "Your horses started something," Betty Wilson said, arriving for a final interview. Her articles had won a regional journalism award, but more importantly, they'd inspired other communities to look closer at their own dark corners. People aren't looking away anymore. The fund established from Tucker's seized assets had already saved hundreds of horses. John's barn now served as a temporary shelter for rescued animals, with local volunteers helping rehabilitate them before adoption. But the biggest change was in the community itself. People who had once minded their own business now spoke up, reported concerns, stood together against cruelty. The Miller farm had become a symbol of what ordinary people could accomplish when they chose to act. "Emma was right," John told Sarah, as they watched the horses play in the spring sunshine. "Sometimes God puts things in your path because you're the one meant to handle them." The mare led her foals to the fence, strong and proud, finally home. In saving them, John had saved something in himself and in their community. Some victories weren't measured in court decisions or bank accounts, but in the simple triumph of doing what was right. Spring flowers bloomed where snow had once threatened. 3 lives, and in their gentle beauty hope took root and grew.